Good evening, Resident Evil enthusiasts. It's getting dark outside. I hope you don't mind that little someone watching over your shoulder. I am here, once again, to share with you some more secret files, theories, and insights on Resident Evil 8 Village. Tonight we will be exploring Franz Kafka's novella, The Metamorphosis, and its many parallels to the Wesker children and Ozwell E. Spencer. This analysis will be very, very thorough, so be sure to check out the timestamps in the description to find what you need. I will spend the next 3 headers framing how the novella will tie into Resident Evil, and on the 4th header, we'll dive into the book's analysis and parallels. I've made multiple videos now that dive deeper into the original Japanese translations of RE Revelations 2 and uncover the close connections between the unrelated Wesker children, Albert and Alex Wesker. I suggest checking these 3 videos out first as a precursor to today's comprehensive analysis of Franz Kafka's novel and how it shapes the Weskers and Spencer in Resident Evil. Huge thanks once again to the Plant42 Tumblr blog for providing original Japanese translations for us to explore. Their link is in the description, and here is their Ko-fi page to support them. And please do. These translations are not quick nor easy, and it's amazing what they reveal about the writer's intentions for the future of this story. Now, brace yourself, as this one's going to get scary. Ozwell E. Spencer, a name that in the original translation literally means the ringleader of darkness who craved the throne of an eternal god, and very fitting that name truly is. Spencer at his core is the physical manifestation of the ever-ravenous search for power, immortality, and godhood. Holding a firm conviction that the world was tainted by human degeneracy and self-corruption, he dreamt of birthing a pure utopia of prodigies and phenoms. And thus, he embarked on the Wesker Project, filtering out 13 artificially selected candidates, which he planned to expose to the progenitor virus, Spencer's panacea for this corrupted world, but only for those compatible with it. This virus was administered through manipulation, killing 11 of the prospective perfect beings Spencer so longed to manufacture, leaving only 2. Albert and Alex Wesker. It's astonishing how Capcom's writing and storytelling of Resident Evil never quite encompassed the childhood of these 2 unrelated Wesker children. We see the outcome of Spencer's influence on them. We know they received the absolute peak of education that money could possibly buy, all on Spencer's dime. We understand they were chosen for their gifted intellect and abilities above all else in this world. And of course, we understand that the progenitor virus made Albert the supreme being Spencer desired, at least in a physical sense, and cast a nasty scar upon Alex in the form of a terminal, degenerative illness, having essentially polar opposite effects. But what happened in those early years of development for these 2? How did Spencer treat them as a metaphorical father among 2 eugenically chosen children that he had invested so faithfully in? While the Resident Evil games hold little information about the Weskers' upbringing, another source offers some promising implications, not in a game, but in a different medium. That's right, as a novella written by the 20th century writer of a uniquely dark style of fiction, Franz Kafka. While Kafka's influence on Resident Evil is hinted at in multiple Resident Evil titles, RE Revelations 2 seems to suggest a huge surge of inspiration in telling the story of Albert and Alex Wesker and Ozwell E. Spencer as well, having chapters literally named after the works of Kafka, such as Contemplation and Judgment, as well as quotes from his works on the loading screens. The first 3 parts of the game are titled off of Kafka's short stories, while the 4th is named after perhaps one of his most famous works, The Metamorphosis. This novella holds many secrets for us, particularly in the inspirations of the Wesker children and Ozwell E. Spencer. 2 of my previous videos explain just why The Metamorphosis is so significant to the connections between the Weskers and Spencer. I implore you to check those out, as they explore files that imply how close Albert and Alex truly were in the original Japanese writing before the English localizations really undermined their closeness and their relationship. Before we dive into the novel and its parallels, there is one original file translation I want to present to you as a precursor to the novel. Alex was tasked by Spencer to create a virus to prolong his life, and given that Alex had not fully adapted the progenitor virus, she was in search of the same in order to cure her terminal illness. This file was written by Alex Wesker herself in regards to Franz Kafka and her intense obsession with his life and legacy. Both the English and Japanese versions hold a similar meaning in this case. Alex understands that the main character in the Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa, represents Franz Kafka himself, and that his works illustrate concepts of fear, madness, and incredible, inevitable despair. She praised Kafka for achieving immortality through his famous, timeless works of fiction, and was inspired to create her own immortality through fear itself in the form of T-Phobos. How appropriate, considering Alex designed T-Phobos to initiate in response to fear in the hosts, with Phobos literally meaning fear. She used this to filter out a candidate impervious to that fear, an adaptive vessel that could save her declining state, and she found that particular candidate in Natalia Korda to successfully initiate her mind transfer. So her entire design philosophy of the deadly experiment with her hosts in Revelations 2 was inspired by her obsession with Kafka and his writings shaped by fear and despair. Now, like in my previous video, regarding my theories on the rebirth of Spencer and Albert Wesker, we can collect so much insight from this mural on the gate of the Resident Evil 8 trailer. We had deduced that this monstrous beast, clutching and feasting on a smaller being, is very strongly reminiscent of the painting Saturn Devouring His Son by Spanish artist Francisco Goya. With my friend Kat's help, we had discovered that in this violent depiction, with Saturn being the large figure and his son Jupiter depicted as a severed, headless corpse, Saturn represents Spencer and Jupiter represents Albert Wesker, Spencer's metaphorical son. It's incredible how dark and sinister this depiction is, and all the more appropriate that the novella, The Metamorphosis, portrays the father-son relationship in such a similar manner, as we'll dive into deeply later. The woman with the spear in this photo resembles Saturn's daughter, Juno, which makes her Jupiter's sister, therefore representing Alex Wesker, who seems to be fending off her merciless father Spencer from feasting on Albert. With these parallels mapped out, we are much more ready to dive into the novella, The Metamorphosis, understanding how tightly knitted the connections between the Wesker children and Spencer truly are, and just how influential these lost bits of lore are to Resident Evil Village, especially when all dialogue implying the closeness between Albert and Alex Wesker was lost in translation from Japanese to English, which is a huge shame. Again, please view my previous videos to better understand how much more the original Japanese translations touched on their shared motivations and love for each other, despite embarking on separate endeavors for much of the lore. Now finally, that all of these parallels are set in place, keep them in mind as we journey deep into the Kafkaesque, exploring the novel where the inspirations for the Resident Evil Wesker children and their father are etched so intricately and so masterfully. The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, a tale in which a traveling salesman, Gregor Samsa, inexplicably finds himself transformed into a giant insect on one unfortunate morning. He is no longer able to communicate with, nor exist in the presence of, his family, as they are so repulsed by his presence, and he is only kept alive by his sister Grete, who feeds him twice a day in an isolated room, a story which illustrates Kafka's ailment of spiritual impoverishment and lack of meaningful existence as an inconvenient, sudden transformation into a nasty, vermin-like being. The parallels in this story to Franz Kafka's life are very apparent and easier to understand with a bit of context. Gregor represents Franz himself, a young breadwinner who carries the obligation of providing for his family, while Gregor's father, Herr Samsa, represents, quite obviously, Franz's father, Hermann Kafka, even holding similar first names. It is crucial to understand the psychologically abusive trauma his father instilled upon Franz since his youth. His father held insurmountable expectations for him, so high that no matter what Franz did, he felt unfulfilled and worthless. As you may have guessed or known, Albert Wesker himself is the parallel to Franz and therefore Gregor Samsa, and Spencer is the parallel to Hermann Kafka and therefore Herr Samsa, Gregor's dad, in the novel. While Franz took an interest in literature and art, his father steered him away from all of his own interests and into law school, spelling his future out for him. What a shame that one of the greatest literary minds of the 20th century was forced to work jobs so utterly beneath him in a law office and then in an insurance firm, all because his tyrannical father never saw him fit for anything beyond such mediocrity and never saw him for the outstanding recognition he possesses today. Very reminiscent of how young Albert was ripped away from his family and his ambitions as he knew them, and brought in to be educated on Spencer's dime as part of the Wesker project. He became a single cog in a giant system of Spencers, just as Franz felt he was a worthless cog in a convoluted system of bureaucracies. No one knows Albert or Alex Wesker's history before being forcefully abducted, their lives completely rebranded to fit Spencer's own ambitions. Imagine what position Albert would have held in this world if not for Spencer's obsession with eugenics and utopia, and his own selfish godhood in that utopia. Imagine the potential for what all 13 Wesker children could be, really, had Spencer not ripped them away from their lives. After all, they were the most gifted, only to end up either dead or consumed with an insatiable lust for power. Given that Hermann Kafka had multiple children in real life and spelled out their worth in his very own mind, Hermann the person and Herr Samsa, the father character, serve as very dark yet fitting parallels to Ozwell E. Spencer, acting as a tyrant on his own otherworldly, outlandish desires. One of the keys to understanding the aura of despair in Kafka's writing is to understand the incessant psychological abuse he suffered from his father, and where he needed encouragement, compassion, and guidance, he got abasement, torture, and a loss of purpose. There are two key passages in the Metamorphosis which embody the immense trauma Kafka felt from his father. The first occurs the very first time Gregor is seen by his father after witnessing his family as a giant insect, and his father fetches his cane and hounds Gregor back into his room. All the while, his father makes a strange hissing noise at him, using both newspaper and cane. Even though he is not the animal in this situation, he is indeed the monster out of the two. Kafka writes Gregor fleeing from his father as having a similar anxiety, fear, and trauma that he must have felt himself. The second instance also includes this nightmarish, hyperbolic portrayal of his father. His father, once again, engages in a bloodthirsty march after Gregor, raising his feet higher and higher with each stomp, chasing Gregor the insect for a long time with no explanation, no rationale, and no indication of how long he would pursue this violent chase. When he fails to squash Gregor beneath his feet, he gives up, and he proceeds to pelt Gregor with apples instead, one finally nailing him in the back and causing a painful wound. Only his sister Grete dares to speak out after Gregor is wounded, ending the rampage of their father. Only his sister pleading for his life could save him. This is similar to how we discussed the Resident Evil Village gate mural earlier. Alex is shown as Juno, trying to defend her brother Albert from her tyrannical father. This bug-squashing concept represents Kafka's disdain for human existence and the unforgettable trauma his father imposed on him since young, after which he felt he would be better off smashed beneath his father's feet, as if he were an undesirable and repulsive insect. We know very little of Albert Wesker's upbringing with his metaphorical father, Spencer. Many villains, in fact most villains, have a story characterized by childhood abuse, trauma, neglect, and crippling fear of disappointment in the eyes of their parents. The way this parallel is portrayed in the novella is extremely dark and abusive of Albert, painting Spencer as a vicious monster with insatiable expectations, pushing Albert to the limits of severe maltreatment, perhaps through mental disparage and possibly even physical abuse. This holds true in the Mural and the Resident Evil 8 trailer as well, with Spencer as Saturn, feasting on his son Albert's sanity, freedom, and sense of self-worth. After all, he is investing in the assets that he has artificially selected as being the fruits of his lifelong labor and will presumably push them to succeed with no restrictions and no limits, as his thirst for godhood would only grow greater. Perhaps the stomping, bug-squashing chase would apply to Spencer and Albert as his way of making Albert feel depreciated, belittled, and worthless, that nothing would satisfy Spencer's expectations of Albert's potential, forging him over the years into the power-hungry monstrosity we know. After all, without Project Wesker, and Spencer abducting Albert to be redirected towards a greater yet more sinister purpose, what place did Albert have in this world? How important was he really, without Spencer's ambitions? Well, according to Kafka, and perhaps the writers of Resident Evil, Gregor was of minuscule importance or worth without absolutely obeying his father, and the parallel illustration of Spencer chasing around a young Albert as a mere insect represents precisely Albert's worthlessness and shortcomings of impossible expectations in the eyes of his father. Grete Samsa, the sister of Gregor, serving as the only member of the family that sees him after his metamorphosis, entering his room twice a day to bring him food. While Alex does hold several parallels to Grete and makes multiple references to her, she herself makes it a point to diverge from Grete in the novel on one matter. In the original Japanese translation of the Revelations 2 scene of Alex shooting herself, provided by the Plant 42 Tumblr, Alex quotes the novel, "Gregor Samsa, he was cast aside by his sister, which led to his death. My brother, our destiny, I will make sure it's different. Our salvation is in death." In the end of this novel, Grete declares that the family must rid itself of Gregor the insect if they are to have any chance at all of restoring their lives. The Resident Evil writers must have chosen this distinction between Alex Wesker and Grete Samsa to imply Alex's insistence on her and Albert's salvation in death and rebirth through mind transferal to finish the work their father had started, but for their own benefit. In fact, in another original translation file called Stewart's Memorandum, with Stewart being a researcher under Alex, he states, "Albert existed like a brother, and my lady, no, Alex, was brought deep sorrow and loneliness from his death. The lost plan of Albert Wesker for Alex Wesker to become immortal would surely succeed. At this moment, it is time that all plans extending from Lord Spencer become one. This confirms her shared motivations with Albert, and as implied here, as well as in an interview with Revelations 2 director Yasuhiro Anpo, Albert's research of viruses and Ouroboros was actually aimed at saving Alex of her terminal disease, making her immortal. This concept of Albert's desire to cure Alex and lift her into godhood, as Spencer had wished for himself, has an incredibly interesting parallel in the novella. Let me explain. Gregor's sister, Grete, had been brought in an immense deal of sorrow and pain from Gregor's metamorphosis and eventual death, just like Stewart had written about Alex's sorrow in response to Albert's death. Grete has long been seen as useless by her family and given a surge of purpose when Gregor's metamorphosis occurs. However, she did possess a passion for musical performance as she played the violin beautifully. Before transforming, Gregor had a secret plan to use some of his saved money and send her to study music at the conservatory. He would plant his faith in her potential, like her family and her father especially would never do. Not only does the rest of her family view her as having little worth or potential in the novella, but the visitors who rent a room in their place are very unimpressed, very unamused with her violin playing one day. The air of disappointment and lack of faith in her to pursue her own independent ambitions is representative of Spencer's massive disappointment in Alex Wesker's incompatibility with the progenitor virus. Out of the two surviving Wesker children, Albert was seen as a greater success by Spencer due to the superhuman physical enhancements he gained from his exposure to the progenitor virus, while Alex was seen as a failure who failed to ascend in the way Albert did. In fact, in the Resident Evil 5 scene in which Albert speaks to Spencer, Spencer doesn't even mention Alex, saying only one Wesker child survived, you. At a time when Alex was alive and functional, this is indicative of his view of Alex as a failure who fell short of Spencer's vision for her. This difference in potential and value, as seen by Spencer, is illustrated by Grete's family never believing in her own ambitions. They believed Gregor's rise in position and wages as a salesman, his saved earnings, and a new house for the family to be the highest success of the children. The Samsa parents continued to confine her to mundane homemaking work and even ended the novella by suggesting it was time to find her a good man to marry at the tender age of 17. This is representative of the standards of the sexist time period of the novella, but also implies a strong preference of Spencer towards Albert as his true successor, with Alex being a secondary successor or a backup plan. Only after Albert's death did Alex's study of immortality and rebirth really matter to an old dying Spencer, just like in the novella. Only after Gregor's death at the end of the story do their parents view Grete as a chance for a second wind, a potential phoenix to rebirth the vitality of their family, literally describing the descent and rebirth of their position in Grete's complexion. Heir and Frau Samsa were struck almost as one while observing their daughter, who was growing ever more vivacious, by the thought that, despite all the torments that had made her cheeks grow pale, she had recently blossomed into a beautiful, voluptuous girl. It seemed to them almost a confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions when their daughter swiftly sprang to her feet and stretched her young body. This is a metaphor for Alex's successful rebirth in her mind transfer to Natalia. Grete, as well as her family, had been completely drained of any light and dreadfully scarred from Gregor's death, and only the restoration of youth in their daughter could and would save them. Just like how a dying Alex could only continue her work and ambitions by transferring into a younger, healthier vessel in Natalia Corda. Albert gets closer to Alex and forges a goal to save her of her terminal illness, and his plan to do so can be seen as a parallel to Gregor's plan in the novella of sending her to the conservatory with his own money to fuel her passions in a way her parents would never allow. Therefore, Alex's disease is almost a metaphor for the sexist, predetermined lifestyle that Grete's father had confined her to, and the restriction of any of her own ambitions or aspirations. Albert's dream of saving Alex of her disease, then, is paralleled by Gregor's dream of saving Alex from her father's chains and restrictions on her own dreams and ambitions by fueling them himself. How appropriate this is, too, because in the same way that Kafka was ripped away from pursuing his passions in art and literature, Grete in the novella was torn away from chasing her dreams in music. Their fathers stripped them of any dreams they had for themselves and forcefully realigned them to pursue the dreams he set for them. Just like Spencer brutally ripped the Wesker children away from their original families and manipulated them for his own goals of omnipotence and immortality. After all, as the psychological abuse the writer Kafka made him believe, it is often safer to be in chains than to be set free. Spencer himself must have been inspired as a character, as an exaggerated, aristocratic form of Kafka's father who deemed his ruling to be the divine one and could be challenged by no one. My oh my, what a wealth of rich parallels we were able to draw here. I hope you enjoyed what I was able to draw from Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis in relation to Resident Evil. I find the inspiration in a novel like this to be limitless, and I could go on for hours. I could talk about the romantic fantasy Gregor stirs up with Grete and how it parallels their characters in the Resident Evil 8 Mural, as Jupiter and Juno were not only brother and sister in Roman mythology, they were lovers too. And the roleplay community behind Alex and Albert Wesker have similar such musings too regarding the two Weskers. I could talk about how all three of these inspired characters, Albert, Alex, and Spencer, individually have a Gregor metamorphosis parallel of themselves, Albert's being the canonical one, Alex's being her transformation into the hideous monster due to her fear response moments before her death, and Spencer's simply becoming an old, frail, dying man. How different would it be, really, to wake up as an old man that has lost all vitality than to wake as a large insect? Perhaps there are more metaphors and parallels to be explored, and I have faith that you'll continue to find them. Thank you. Yes, you who are watching. You have inspired me to analyze and theorize to heights I couldn't have imagined, and you fuel me with your own ideas. So special thanks to all of you, namely Kat, who has offered me such a wealth of insight and information and become a friend in the process. Special thanks, as well, to the Plant 42 Tumblr blog, as none of these Wesker connections and dialogue would be noticeable without the original Japanese writings. Please support them. I'll be resting a bit after this one, but not for long, as I never really do. I'll see you again soon, I'm sure. Perhaps sooner than you may expect.